always true.
The human cost of Israel's ongoing war on Gaza is becoming increasingly evident. For those on the ground, the reality is stark and harrowing. With ongoing bombardments and almost non-existent infrastructure, how are people coping as food, water and other basic essentials they need become increasingly scarce? And is there any way the humanitarian crisis in Gaza can be alleviated? Matthew Hollingworth, the country director for the World Food Programme in Palestine, talks to Al Jazeera. Matthew Hollingworth, country director for Palestine at the World Food Programme. Thank you for joining us here on Talk to Al Jazeera. You've been focusing your attention in recent days on the north of Gaza. Can you just give us your impression of what you're seeing right now?
Gaza City, Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia are decimated. These are all still populated areas where almost no buildings still stand. Roads have been chewed up. Sewage is in the streets. There's very little clean water. The access to healthcare is almost impossible. There's no fresh food in the markets. People are dependent for their existence on aid. And it's a pretty dire place. Jabalia has changed immeasurably just in the past month since the last time I was there. It is so much more destroyed than it was, and yet people are still there. They've returned, in fact, and they are living in the most incredibly difficult circumstances. At the moment, our best estimation is that around 300 to 350,000 people are still living in Gaza City in the north of the Gaza Strip. Many of them, over the past month, were displaced from, for example, Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia into Gaza City, and some of those people are going back now from Gaza City. But nobody is able to return from the south into Gaza, the city itself in the north. But people are, incredibly resilient. They are enormously brave, but they're also enormously traumatized. They're going back because there are no places for them to stay. So they're going back to semi-destroyed or heavily populated homes that they're sharing with family and community. It really is a very difficult place.
What sort of difficulties and challenges are they facing, and are you facing in trying to at least get, you might say, hot meals or the ingredients for hot meals to them?
I mean, there's very little in terms of fuel which is coming into the Gaza Strip, and what does come in is being utilised for things like bakeries, hospitals, to keep them running. But there's very little fuel going into people's homes. So cooking is incredibly difficult. It's one of the reasons why people are having to exist so much and depend so much on canned food, because it needs little cooking. But what does exist, whether it's trees that have been chopped down to be burned, broken up furniture and wood from buildings that have been destroyed, that's all being used at people's homes to cook on. But it's incredibly difficult for people. And what we've also found, of course, is that so many of those families are again, they're sharing what little they have, and we know that they're not getting enough in terms of assistance to really get back to a healthy diet. So while we've seen some improvement with increased aid going into the north, particularly in the past month, we're just not seeing the dietary diversity. Water is a serious challenge, as we've mentioned, and people are reliant on going to the few stand pumps that still exist, the water bowsers that deliver water into some of the neighbourhoods, but people then queue with their buckets or their jerry cans to receive, but only a small portion of the amount of water that they need to survive each day. There's almost nobody across the entirety of the Gaza Strip that's getting 15 clean litres of water a day, which is the absolute minimum. People are getting a fraction of that, and it is a serious worry. It's a public health care disaster waiting to happen, and it's hot here. You know, we're in the mid-30s in terms of centigrade, and it will get worse as the summer goes on.
And we'll talk about those aid trucks and that aid coming in and the issues around those border crossings in a moment. But can I just talk to you about the word famine? It's a word that's been bandied around in the international community, at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, within capital cities across the Middle East. But as a first-hand witness, can you tell us, are we really that close to famine? We have heard of incidents of children dying. Where are we on that famine scale? Are we there?
Famine is the most frightening word for somebody like me to ever hear. With 25 years working in this role, famine means we've failed. Famine means thousands of people are dying of hunger-related deaths. Famine means you can't stop something from getting worse. Famine means failure. What we are seeing is extreme, forms of hunger, acute forms of hunger, but we are actually not seeing the famine that we were seeing as imminent a few months ago, mainly because so much food assistance has gone in. But it doesn't mean people aren't suffering. It doesn't mean that some children are not dying from malnutrition-related deaths, because that is happening. But what you're not seeing is that enormous number suffering death because of starvation. We are, however, still incredibly concerned because this is such a fragile situation. We've had a lot of assistance going into the north over the last 5 or 6 weeks. We got a lot more than we were able to do in any of the 4 or 5 months before that. But it still needs to continue. It needs to be sustained. And famine is not just about food. It's about nutrition. It's about healthcare. It's about clean water. And if all of those aspects are not dealt with equitably, appropriately, it can go back to being as bad as it was. So we may have seen an improvement, but boy, that is fragile.
You talk about getting aid in equitably, but that aid has to come through specific corridors, specific checkpoints that are all controlled by the Israelis. You say the situation has got better over the past few weeks, but that's a small proportion of the 7-month war that Gazans and Palestinians have been experiencing. So let's talk about the aid that has come in and the quantities. How many trucks have come in the past 5 weeks on a ballpark average compared to what should come in?
Into the north, we're seeing, between 80 and sometimes as many as 100 trucks of assistance coming in every day, which is so much better than when we were trying to just get into double digits in January and February and March. But it's not enough, and it's not enough in terms of the diversity of the kinds of assistance that's needed.
But can I interrupt there and ask you? Can I ask you why it's? Can I ask you there, Matthew, why it's not enough? Why it's not coming in? What are the reasons for those aid trucks not getting into the north of Gaza?
I mean, at the moment, we're reliant on essentially one corridor to get into the north of Gaza, and that's through the Zikim entry point, or the Asiafa entry point into the northwest. However, we actually want and need to have every corridor functioning. Assistance coming in from the north, the central, the south. We need the assistance to cover multi-sectoral requirements, not just food. We need the services to be provided, not just in-kind aid to be handed over. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. It is an active war zone. We are constantly, daily, having to negotiate the access and navigate through what is a war zone to get assistance to people that need it. And that's all incredibly complicated. It could all be much easier if there was a ceasefire, but we haven't had a ceasefire.
Before we talk then about the ceasefire and about navigating aid into the Gaza Strip, let's talk about the negotiations you have to complete before that aid can ever reach those checkpoints. It's reported that the UN Secretary-General has been unable to speak to the Israeli Prime Minister since the beginning of this war. That is the top level of politics. you are further down the pecking order. How difficult is the job for you to negotiate with the Israelis to get those aid trucks in?
I'm certainly very much down in the pecking order. But I mean, for us, it's a daily discussion. And we're speaking with people at various levels of the Israeli authorities and the Israeli Defense Forces and the various bodies that they've created to coordinate this entry of assistance. It's incredibly time-consuming. It's incredibly hard work. It's reliant on persistence. It's reliant on patience. And, you know, for every success we have, there are 3 failures, guaranteed. But we try and we continue every day. My teams are getting up every day at 6 a.m. They get back from deliveries every day at between 10, 11, 12 p.m. Or 12 a.m. in fact. And it's incredibly difficult. But we haven't stopped and we won't stop. But what we do need is for this to be simplified. We need that consistent at-volume delivery if we're going to not just prevent the very worst of suffering, but actually turn this around and help people to get back much more closer to where they were before this crisis
What
started.
is the difficulty, though, Matthew? Is it the genuine negotiation between the Israelis and yourselves to get it through the border? Is it the volume or the numbers of trucks that cannot come through those border checks? Or is it an issue of security once you've got those trucks into the Gaza Strip? Then you have to start thinking about the security of those trucks, the drivers, and getting them to the locations that need them most.
This shouldn't be a logistical crisis in terms of how of the constraints we face to deliver. You know, there are roads. We're in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we can buy goods, procure goods easily across all sectors in this region for delivery. We're not talking about, you know, very remote areas as in many countries I've worked in the past. It's about will and the will to enable and allow delivery uninterrupted into the areas. But there are those other constraints that you've mentioned. We don't have enough fuel some days to keep all of the trucks rolling across the strip that we want to move. We don't have enough fuel to keep all of the bakeries running. We don't always have enough support from the local communities to get commodities through safely. There is a huge amount of problem because of the law and order issues. We've had maybe 6 or 7 serious events this month alone of looting of trucks that we've been trying to get because criminality is on the rise. There is a vacuum of law and order. The police that could have policed the situation 6 months ago don't exist today in the same numbers that they once did. And so every single move that we make across the strip is difficult. And it's difficult for all of those reasons.
So who's actually protecting you, Matthew, in terms of your convoys and your personnel? Are your personnel at full strength? And how many have you lost during the war?
Protection is obviously our biggest concern for the people of the Gaza Strip. And we face many of the same risks that citizens themselves face. We are, you know, we are driving around and moving around in a war zone, as I've said. We try very hard to notify and coordinate our movements to try and deconflict those movements. But, you know, this is one of the most dangerous places aid workers can work. Around 200 aid workers have been killed in just the short period that this war has taken place, and that's an unprecedented number. These are friends of ours, these are people we've worked with, colleagues from the World Central Kitchen, colleagues from UNRWA, colleagues from the Department of Safety and Security, from the United Nations system, people we know, people that we've worked with, and it is a very dangerous place. There is no simple answer to who protects us. Communities themselves support us because they know we're here to help them and they try and help us during our work. But we don't carry arms and we don't fight back if things are taken from us violently. And we just try and do our jobs. But it is unprecedented. I don't think I've worked anywhere as difficult as this where we haven't had for example, a peacekeeping force or a UN police force to support us. And we're getting close to that because the social fabric of the Gaza Strip is being torn apart because of this war and because of the impact of this war on communities and society.
So you're trying to get food, nutrition and water to locations in northern Gaza and across the Gaza Strip wherever you can. What's the reaction of Palestinians to you when you turn up, either with a truck that is fully loaded or half loaded or even been looted? Are they willing to listen to the problems that you face as the WFP, or have they lost faith in the international aid community?
I think it's a very perceptive question. There's no doubt that with the trauma that people have faced, communities across the Strip have faced over this last 7 months or more, they are angry at the international community. They're angry that this war has continued. They're angry that the acts of a political force in Gaza has created, dispossession, displacement, destruction at such enormous levels, and that it's been allowed to go on for as long as it's gone on. So, yeah, we see a lot of anger, we see a lot of trauma, we see a lot of mental health concerns, but we recognise why we're here and who we're here to help. The most vulnerable, the most needy, those that don't have a voice and that need our assistance. And we are constantly amazed by the support that we do receive from community leaders and communities themselves, and the resilience that they show in trying to help their neighbours or their past neighbours or new neighbours, in many cases, because people have been displaced so many times. When the North was receiving almost no aid whatsoever, and we would get, once or twice in a couple of weeks, a successful convoy to get in, there was so much fear, so much anxiety, so much trauma, and so much desperation that people would rush towards us as we literally crossed a front line. And in many cases, as they rushed towards those front lines, they were fired on, and fired on by tanks, fired on by machine guns, and yet they still came running. And they jumped onto trucks to pass food down to their friends and their family and their communities, and they'd still be fired on. And some of them would be hit and they'd fall, and still people would come. I've never seen desperation like that in my life. I've never seen courage like that in my life. But it was frightening to see. So that's at least an example of an incident that I don't think I've seen anything like that anywhere else in the world. And I hope never to have to see it again, and I hope Gazans never have to experience that ever again.
You're an experienced field officer with the WFP, and you've operated in countries such as Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, both north and south. I would say, is this any different from what you've experienced, or what are the differences or similarities with Gaza, or is Gaza so unique you've never seen anything like this before?
I think we've seen aspects of the reality for Gazans in different emergencies that I've worked in, war zones, complex emergencies around the world. But what's really different here is that it is such a small, densely populated area where people, at the beginning of this war, they ran away from Beit Lahia, they ran away from Beit Hanun to Gaza City, they ran from Gaza City to Nusayrat, they ran from Nusayrat to Deir al-Balah, they ran from Deir al-Balah to Khan Yunis, they ran from Khan Yunis to Rafah, always seeking a safe haven, a safe place, and now they're running back. And those safe havens don't exist, and they were unable to leave. Now, I've worked in Ukraine recently, I've worked in the Sudans, I've worked in Syria, I've worked in Afghanistan, I've worked in Iraq. In all of those operations, people could run away. They could cross borders and leave. They could find safety, whether long-term or short-term, and then return back to their place of origin. That's not happening in Gaza. Gazans are stuck. They are stuck inside this little strip of land, and they have been displaced 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And every time they're displaced, some part of their resilience has gone. It fades away. The people that they were displaced with from the beginning were their community, were their neighbours. They're no longer their neighbours today. There's not enough space for them to go back to. People that stayed in Rafah for 5 months, they knew where to get water every morning, which queue to join. They knew which takia, which kitchen to go to get a meal. They knew how to ensure that their child could get to a field hospital when they were sick. Now they are moved again, and it all starts from scratch. They have to learn all over again where they are, who their neighbours are, whether they are safe. And the whole society around them has changed. It's so incredibly difficult. And it's hot, and it's humid, and it's dirty, and there's sewage in the streets, and the refuse, garbage that hasn't been picked up since the war began, rotting. There's flies, there's stench. It's miserable.
It can often be said that a picture can paint 1,000 words, and sometimes high-ranking officials visiting a war zone or a conflict zone can be a game changer, especially in places like Syria or Iraq or North and South Sudan. There is no access for senior high-level officials to actually enter Gaza. You need Israeli permission to do that. So how important is it that there is a role for social media as such to be able to explain the desperation that people face there in areas that even you can't get to?
It is shocking to me that there isn't a free press and an ability of the press to be here inside the Gaza Strip to report as much as they should do and should be able to do on what's happening here. And that's one of the reasons why social media has become so important and why citizens themselves who have access, or almost fleeting access most of the time, to some kind of connectivity, to share messages and tell their stories and tell the world what they're facing, why that is so important. But again, I think there would be a big change and a much faster change if there were stories from all manner of media outlets coming out here, from the right to the left, so everybody's taste could actually be accommodated, and they could listen to those they trust. People will not always trust the media that they get access to, but they might trust the media that they've always watched. But those outlets aren't here. Those journalists aren't being allowed to come in. They should be allowed to come in, and I think that would make a massive difference to war here in Gaza, but any war in the world. Knowing and being able to trust what you're seeing objectively is so critical.
Is it desperate? Is it depressing? What goes through your mind when you see politicians talking the talk, but not really walking the walking, trying to help the people that you are on a daily basis?
Any war is just the failure of a political process. I'm a humanitarian aid worker. I have to be acutely aware of political sensitivities and the politics behind any situation, but that's not my focus. My focus, our focus as humanitarians is reaching people in the greatest of need with assistance when they need it, with the right assistance, and helping to ensure that their voice is heard so that we can actually improve their situation, save their lives, perhaps even change their lives for better when we can. But obviously it's critical that there are discussions around human rights and protection, the international humanitarian law, the politics around finding a ceasefire solution, the compromise, ensuring that the hostages are released, ensuring that the ceasefire comes, ensuring that Gazans don't have to suffer anymore. These are all critical discussions that need to happen.
It's been often said that when people face starvation, you can't just throw food at them and hope everything's going to get better. It is a process that requires medical experts to help those that have been affected the most through those starvation symptoms to get back to full health. And for that, you need not just medicine, but you need the medical practitioners as well to help you distribute that food aid.
There's no question you can't fix a situation that has become as acute as the one we see today overnight. It takes time, and it takes professional understanding of how to provide that support. And it's always critical to recognise, as I've said, it's not just about food and nutrition. It's about water. It's about healthcare. It's about an enabling environment so that people sleep and feel safe, and that we can deal with the trauma and the mental health concerns, and that we can make sure people have shelter and support around them to recover. It's about changing what is the current level of destruction and starting to rebuild. And that's going to take decades. Children of today, toddlers of today, will grow up into adolescents, will grow up into adults. They've all faced trauma that most people in the world couldn't ever imagine. Many of them have not had enough nutrition to grow up as healthy as they should grow up. And some of them will be permanently scarred from that, physically and mentally. And this is going to be the greatest challenge as we move forward.
So, Matthew, I just want to ask you to give our international audience the name of one person that you've met, that you've seen and you've dealt with, whose story haunts you and keeps you awake at night. Because I can't believe you can stay in Gaza for this amount of time and not be affected by at least one story.
There's probably 1,000 stories, to be honest. I met a little boy today, I'm not going to give you his name, who I was talking to outside a bakery we've helped to reopen. And I asked him what he ate today, and he said he had some bread. And what did he eat yesterday? And he said he had some bread, which worried me enormously, because this is a place, an area that should be receiving assistance, but isn't receiving as much as they should yet. And I asked him what his dream was. And I was expecting, because I was talking to him about, what did he want to grow up and be? I said, what's your dream? What do you really want? What do you really wish for? And he said to me, he said he wished he had vegetables and meat to eat.
So what's your message then, you think, from that little boy to the international community?
This war has to end. I think everybody with compassion and empathy and belief and kindness in their heart knows we have to have a ceasefire. It has to stop now. The hostages have to go home. The families who are scared for their well-being need to also know that their loved ones are back at home with them. But this war has to stop.
Well, let's hope it does very soon. For the moment, Matthew Hollingworth, Country Director for Palestine for the World Food Programme, thanks so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.